Thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon. I know the air conditioning is probably helpful compared to how hot it is outside. Thank you, Maggie, for your efforts in putting this together. So as Maggie mentioned, my academic trajectory started initially at Northwestern as an undergrad. And it was actually there where I started to first think about disability as a topic. This is a screenshot from the Northwestern School of Communication webpage, departments that they have. So you'll notice that one of my majors was communication studies. There's also a whole other range of performance studies, radio, TV, film, theater, and they all sort of have either kind of a social science or a performance kind of background. But for the life of me, I couldn't understand why communication sciences and disorders was also part of that collection. It had communication in the title, but I didn't get how all those things really fit under one banner. And it stuck with me as I continued my graduate degrees in communication. So really reconciling, well, how does this field of communication studies, which is itself a pretty big tent, how does that connect to the communication sciences, which we might think of as something more clinical, something more medical even potentially. So that sort of kicked off this ongoing project in my work. So I currently study the social and cultural implications of communication technologies with a focus on the role of digital and mobile media, such as the iPad, which is pictured here with a mother and her two children, in the everyday lives of children with developmental disabilities, such as autism and childhood apraxia of speech, which is essentially a condition in which the brain has difficulty coordinating the body parts that are needed to speak. So I set, as Maggie mentioned, an agenda for studying what was the digital lives of young people with disabilities outside of just the identities of being a student or being a patient. What about just being a kid? What does that look like? And this was more of a review of what research had been done up until that point, 2014, and some additional commentary that I provided. And I say digital youth with disabilities, but that's not a heterogeneous population. So when we think about all the other intersections of individuals' identity, whether that is within a disability label, across different disability categories, by age, by gender, race, ethnicity, class, and so forth. But my second book, pictured here, Giving Voice, builds on that prior work with a more specific focus. So Giving Voice chronicles ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted from 2012 to 2014 among children with significant speech disabilities who communicate through a system that is much like the one that Stephen Hawking pictured here uses, but instead of it being a very expensive computer that is primarily dedicated to his use of speech. Instead, I was studying the fact that nowadays kids are using iPads and tablets in general. But I was really interested in addition to that, how is this population using an iPad for communication in this way also? So this is a picture of the specific app that I ended up focusing on after a couple of months of fieldwork just studying what kinds of these devices were out there, an app called ProLoco to Go. So this is a screen, kind of a sample screen from the app where you can select icons and text, and it will fill the white bar, and you can press the bar, and speech will be output from the device. For those that are unfamiliar, there's a couple different terms that are used clinically for these kinds of technologies. So a voice output communication aid, a speech generating device, or an augmentative and alternative communication device, which is ironically a mouthful to say. So besides Stephen Hawking, though, you may have also seen AAC, and that's how I'll refer to it in the rest of the talk as a shorthand, in the ABC sitcom Speechless. So it features JJ, who is on the end pictured here, who has cerebral palsy and who uses a communication system that and who does not speak or speaks. He has the ability to produce some oral utterances and sound, but not speech that is widely intelligible for majority of communication partners. So instead what happens is there's a laser pointer that's attached to his glasses. There's a board with different words that's attached to his wheelchair over here. And his aide, Kenneth, speaks the words and sentences that JJ selects. Kind of a very complex communication system that is somewhat embellished for the purposes of network sitcom television. But for kids like JJ, and especially those for whom electronic communication systems are what they might use primarily to communicate, historically there's been a particular way in which this gets discussed in the popular media. So these are two headlines from 1980, one from 2012. This is from CNN. This is from the Los Angeles Times. And the one at the bottom, as you can tell, is about the iPad. iPad gives voice to kids with autism. Up above, it's a headline that's about another technology that was actually also produced, instead of Apple, by another mainstream communication technology company, Canon. You might think of as the cameras. Produced something called the Canon Communicator. And the headline here says, "Electronic help for the handicapped. The voiceless break their silence." Many decades apart, very similar framings about voice and about technology and about individuals who might use these technologies for expressive purposes. But as somebody who studies communication and is interested in different kinds of power dynamics, I was thinking about in what ways is this notion of giving voice to the voiceless, what does that mean? How are headlines like this and stories like this helpful or harmful potentially? And what if we kept the story going further beyond just the headline, what would it tell us kind of more broadly about people, about technology, and different kinds of interfaces between them and society? So that's what I'll talk about today. So I'll start first by briefly discussing the broader significance of this phrase, giving voice to the voiceless, what we think it might mean more generally. Then I'll kind of follow up by why I think it's a particularly important concept to think critically about in relation to disability. And lastly, I'll propose a way to think differently, perhaps, about voice and voicelessness, and how this might generate new considerations of technology and ethics. Speaking of ethics, before I go much further, so this is a photo of a march supportive of the passage of the ADA in New York City under the banner Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And this says a little bit about how I approach disability in thinking about the intersections of different kinds of civil rights movements and different kinds of ways in which individuals seek justice. So I do not personally identify as having a disability. I'm also white and cisgender and straight and upper middle class. So I'm sensitive to the fact that there's power inherent in interpreting and sharing the experiences of others through my particular analytic lens. But I also believe that disability, as I'm sure a number of you do here, is at the heart really of the human experience more broadly, and that its study has important implications for all aspects of society. Particularly though, as we consider, and I'll talk more about, that there is also the process in which individuals with disabilities across different intersections themselves some are less included than others by proxy of things like race or gender, class, and so forth. So that's what I'll talk about today. So with that being said, this phrase, giving voice to the voiceless, I want to turn it over somewhat participatory in a way, if anybody would like to say what this phrase means to you.
Well, it makes the voiceless sound, it's sort of a passive thing. Like the poor voiceless person's here, and we're going to give them what they need.
So there's something passive, something maybe paternalistic about it.
I also think it's kind of based on society as well. You know, some people, you know, can't really speak their mind, so they're pretty much voiceless because, you know, society, you know, judges them, or they think they'll say something, you know, not right, and stuff like that.
So you're kind of talking about tensions between the individual and different maybe social models.
Social, yeah, or their social skills could be very poor, or something like that.
Great.
I see. That voice is only what we hear.
Right, so there's a sort of oral privileging about what voice might mean. AU or N-O-R-A-L, I suppose, as well. Do one more.
Yeah, I was going to actually say something similar. I feel like it's taking away the person's identity and kind of reducing it without a voice. They're nothing, they're the voiceless.
Yeah, so a part that is standing in for the whole in perhaps a skewed way. That's a great, I hadn't exactly thought about it in that way. That's really useful. So one entry point to this might be thinking about the origins of this as a phrase. We might locate it biblically. So Proverbs 31:8, and this is from the New International Version of the Bible, states, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute." Something in there about giving voice in there. This also traces just through some core professions in our society, like journalism. So this is a snapshot from the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. It states that a key journalistic duty is to, quote, "be vigilant and courageous about holding those with power accountable, give voice to the voiceless." I'm interested in particular about the ways in which we associate this voice-giving quality to technology. So this is just a screenshot from a presentation at the Open Data Institute, talking about open data as a kind of accessible, governments making different databases that they have for things like traffic patterns or whatever available to the public to use for certain things. So the idea of citizen empowerment, giving a voice to the voiceless, that might be another way. If we take all of these things together, we might be able to put something together about what giving voice to the voiceless might mean based on at least these contributions to that. So the first, that voice is a metaphor for agency and self-representation. Second, that voicelessness is imagined as a kind of stable and natural category, that there's such a thing as the voiceless, and we can bound them and categorize them as such. And that technology gets imagined very often as this direct and barrier-free gateway to opportunity and expression. That voice, that technology is the giver. It's the giving part. So there's a lot to critique about each of these things, more than we really have time to talk about today. But in my book, I argue that it's particularly important to think critically about this idea of giving voice to the voiceless through the lens of disability. Because all too often, disability serves an instrumental purpose in broader discourses about voice and empowerment. This is a screenshot, and we'll watch the Super Bowl, we'll watch the video that the screenshot comes from in a second. It's a screenshot from Microsoft's Super Bowl ad in 2014. It was the first time Microsoft ever had a Super Bowl commercial. Apple had been doing it for a number of years. Microsoft was a little late to the game. But it's a screenshot here, and we'll watch the video, but it ends on this notion that, about giving voice to the voiceless.
What is technology? What can it do?
When I lost my eyesight, I thought that my painting days were over.
How far can we go?
By using your hands, you can actually control your X-ray.
Technology has the power to unite us.
Hang on, honey. Hang on.
There he is.
I can do.
It inspires us. Technology has taken us places we've only dreamed.
Now I can do whatever I want.
It gives hope to the hopeless. And it has given voice to the voiceless.
You notice that technology is the theme of this commercial, but disability plays a pretty front and center role in some more and less problematic ways. We see prosthetics being highlighted here. Don't know exactly, Microsoft is exactly in the prosthetics building business, but its relationship to fitting is highlighted here. Cochlear implants are part of this commercial, which are not uniformly viewed in any particular way as being beneficial or not beneficial. But it's all swept up in this universal empowerment theme. And the voiceover at the end, or the voiceover of the whole thing, is done by former NFL player Steve Gleason, who has ALS and lost the ability to talk as part of that, and who uses a Microsoft eye gaze system to communicate, which is why he ends up with this giving voice to the voiceless phrase. And it's part of what's going on here is this idea that the deficit, and part of the deficit model of disability, the idea that there is a lack, and that that disability is defined by lack, and that technology makes whole. This is the picture, the key example, I guess, if you were going to point to something like that, what it would say. This would be a sort of deficit-oriented commercial. My reaction, in part, was that. My other reaction was, so we see all these different technologies, and that's, in 60 seconds, you can only kind of say so much. But what happens when this stuff breaks? Who pays for this again? And who maintains it after that? What's this longer tail of the kind of user experience that is being presented here? What happens beyond that? When you think about, there's technologies, there's people, but all those things exist within institutions like healthcare, or the lack thereof, or education, and the lack thereof. So all of those systems, none of that comes through here in any critical, in-depth manner. And I was interested in bringing that into this conversation. So so to do that, I conducted ethnographic research in the greater Los Angeles area over the course of about 16 months. This is a flyer that one of the families of the kids who are using the ProLoquo and the iPad app as an AAC device got. And I put it up here to say that we're here in a place where we talk about user experience, we talk about sort of, accessibility. For an assistive technology that was being given to a kid, it's a pretty inaccessible form. It's very complicated. The way that it's set up, this is about iPad user information, iTunes login, how to sort of set up the technology to help your kid. This is given to parents. I looked at this and I just wanted to back away from it immediately. But these are the kinds of materials that I wanted to get my hands on for the work that I was doing. So I got permission through California's Department of Disability Services, a regional center that's part of that network, who does assistive technology and speech-language pathology services together. And I shadowed two speech-language pathologists, or SLPs, named Rachel and Karen, who are training parents on how to help their kids use that app, ProLoquo, to go in the iPad. So I also, besides doing observations, I did additional interviews with families. I then also interviewed different assistive technology professionals and school administrators in the area. I went to parent conferences. I went to groups that, for kids to hang out with one another and use their devices to hang out and chat. I went to those kinds of kid-oriented meetings. I didn't directly interview the kids were 3 to 13. So I observed them at home playing. My interviews, though, were conducted primarily with their parents, which I'll say now is a limitation of my research prowess at the time, I think, and of the study, and we can talk about that in a little bit. So on the whole, I spent time with about 20 kids that ended up just using ProLoco and the iPad. There were a bunch of other technologies, like I mentioned, that led up to me and kids using other AAC devices before I ended up with this sample. The majority of the kids, sort of half of the kids were, let's say, above median income for the greater Los Angeles area, about half were below. Slight majority, about 11, were kids whose parents checked off the box to say that they were white. But within that sample, there were other kinds of diversity. Really, 7 kids were either immigrants or first-generation American. Their parents were first-generation. The majority were boys, which is probably related to the fact that most of the kids were on the autism spectrum. So there's a co-relationship there potentially as well. So within this kind of cross-section, what I found is that despite widespread claims to give voice to the voiceless, communication technologies intended to universally empower are still subject to disempowering structural inequalities, particularly for people with disabilities. So for the rest of my talk, I'm just going to pick just a couple samples that are from the book to give you a sense of the cultural dimensions of this, the legal dimensions of this, the policy dimensions of this, the technological dimensions themselves, the ways that those aspects of that were part of this exclusionary process, even under this label of this voice-giving, empowering technology. Okay, culture example here. So most speech-generating devices that are used in US schools are programmed to speech output English. Although the parents that I talked to, even who themselves were not native English speakers, were eager for their kids to learn English as part of the US education system, this does put a limit, though, on parents who don't speak English and community members on being able to communicate with their child through such a system. So one AAC specialist that I interviewed said the following. She said, "There are hundreds of languages in these schools. One of the kids I work with, his parents speak Korean at home. Any kind of communication, any kind of assistive communication system that's in English, they wouldn't use it because they don't speak it. It's a big issue. We are stuck doing school-based therapy, which is fine, that's our job, but it's hard. It's hard to support them across the board because we can't." So if we were gonna say something here about voice and voice giving, we could say here that voice is given in some extent, but it's simultaneously muted due to this difference in what kinds of languages are prioritized across the different spaces in which children learn from their teachers, but also from parents and others in which they have contact with. Legally. So with respect to law, a pretty sobering statistic is that assistive technologies are born of a world in which about half of the people who encounter the police and die at the hands of police, half of those individuals are born with have some kind of a disability, sorry. And that awareness shapes how I interpreted and understood something that Danny's dad, Peter, said when he tapped into this fear and anxiety about how a police officer might mistake his son's AAC device for a weapon. So he said, talking about Danny, I need him to be able to gesture yes and no. If a cop's asking him questions and got a gun on him, no cop in the world's going to allow him to grab a talker, to pull out his talker to say something. So we could say here that voice is given, the technology does something here, but using it runs the risk of being silenced forever. That's a sort of way for us to understand the social context. School district policies, another fun field of anybody who has anything to do with education and disability. So school district policies also tend to protect financial investments in technology very often more so than promoting students' continued growth. So families that can, what's interesting about an iPad and potentially great is that you don't have to wait for a whole sort of evaluation process, insurance process. If you are able to, you can just go to the Apple Store and just buy an iPad and then download the Prologue Quote to Go app, and then you're set. You've got something. But that does not reflect everyone's ability, not only financial ability, but awareness that that's even an option or a shortcut that you could even take. But some people are really sort of beholden then to the ways in which schools dole out or don't dole out these technologies and those whims. So a quote, Moira's mom Vanessa relayed a story about the impact of these policies. So she said, the school district, so Moira's school district, changed their policy and said that iPads, with these apps, only remained on campus, which was in violation of Moira's IEP, or Individualized Education Program. Vanessa said, I wrote them and I said, this is in violation. I'm asking that you give me a window of opportunity to purchase her a device for the home. The policy change, I should say, a kid, this is Southern California, some kids had thrown theirs in the pool, and so the school was like, we can't have that, so nobody gets to take them off campus, because we don't want our investment being ruined.
Going down the drain.
Yes, good joke. So one morning, Vanessa said, I was like, I don't want to send this iPad to school. I, of course, gave it to her, and it didn't come home. There's a more complex story about the fallout of this in the book, but just to say here that voice was given, and then it was unjustly taken away. Lastly, the technology itself. See, it gives voice. In what way does it give voice? For whom does it give voice? Because voices come from bodies in some manner. Well, which bodies are prioritized in systems in which choices get made in terms of how they're designed? So this is for AssistAware is the company that produces Prologue Quote to Go. This is a screenshot of the different voice options, the kinds of voices that you can have the technology speak. Stephen Hawking has picked a voice that is maybe a little more mechanical or robotic in nature, but nowadays they have a full range, and I'll actually play you just a clip. So this is the voices. They're organized by country. We can talk about that as a design choice. But so here are the US English options, and I'll just play. So this is Josh, the genuine child voice.
Hello, my name is Josh. I am one of the child's American English speech synthesis voices from the a cappella group AssistAware Premium Voices collection. Efficient, fast, and natural sounding. Why not let me be your voice?
Here is Penny, the artificial child voice.
Hi, I'm Penny, the American English speech synthesis child voice from a cappella. Efficient, fast, and of very high quality. Why not try me out with your own words?
Just a sampling of some of the variation here. And I have sort of slides here that break down the types of voices. So here's them kind of fuller out there. There are 24 options. Do you notice any patterns in what you do or do not see here?
Well, I have a suggestion, maybe like for just a joking matter, maybe put like the voice of Darth Vader or something, or some cartoon voice.
We can get to this later.
Yeah.
What's bad guy down there is actually a false Darth Vader voice.
Oh.
Yeah.
There seems to be
A good idea. Yeah.
There seems to be a lot more male options.
So out of these 24, 16 are in some way associated, engendered male, whether that is explicitly by the word male or whether that is by, I went to YouTube and looked up, they have some videos of people, like the Josh voice is actually a whole production to make that voice, and so they had videos of the voice actors or actresses that were part of those voices. We even have up here there's will. We have will, male adult, but also will from afar, will up close. Will sad, will happy. And actually the bad guy, the Darth Vader-ish voice, is a variation on will. So Will gets to feel a lot of things and express himself in a myriad number of ways. Women, we want to talk about what is explicitly gendered, and to say nothing of the binary dimensions of male or female as two distinct categories. There's a much limited set here. Racially, there's some interesting stuff here. So there's a bilingual. Now you can switch from English to Spanish in Pro Loco to Go. So there's Emilio's English voice and Valeria's English voice, and those same child voices can also speak in Spanish. So you have that option. The rest, then we also have Saul, the hip hop male adult. I will play you Saul, just to say that I did.
Hi, I'm Saul, the hip-hop speech synthesis voice from Acapella. Efficient, fast, and of very high quality. Why not try me out with your own words?
So there is a distinct way in which hip-hop is used as a proxy for black voices. But you might kind of sense that there's also that's a pretty narrow way of defining the experience of being a person of color in general, to like only be the hip hop male adult voice. So why do I sort of go through this whole thing? Well, the fact is that whiteness is the default here. It becomes expressed through the Anglo names, through the racial backgrounds of the actors whose speech is recorded, and it comes through in the ways in which parents talked about these voices. So for some families, these options didn't present a problem. So Corey's mom, Perry, said, I found the voice that just sounded most like a human little boy. Her human was represented. Donna, Sam's mom, also said, the voice that comes out of that's his voice to me. That's Sam. I think the voice is called Kenny. So they actually chose the Kenny voice, the one that was the more robotic one. She said there's a tiny touch of roboticism to it, but oh my God, whenever I hear Kenny in the machine speak, that is Sam to me. So it was easier for, these are the parents of white boys to, and they're white themselves, to be able to hear themselves in the machine, to hear a natural voice be sounded. Parents who came from, whether it was sort of racial or ethnic minority groups, had some disidentification from the technology. So Sarah Isaac's mom said, there's all the Jewish, and this doesn't just have to do with the accent, but just the voice, the capabilities of what can or cannot be said with the technology. So there's all the Jewish food Isaac eats, like challah, which is a bread traditionally eaten in the Jewish culture. I typed it into Pro Loco to Go. It doesn't say it the right way because they can't say the ch the same. So he can't sound like his family members, and he can't say the word as this item that is very much central to their culture. Another family, an Armenian family, Garine, it's Paul Michael's mom, was trying to figure out how to get the device to say the name of a family friend, and the family's friend name is Marinée. So she pulled Rachel over and said, there's one problem, it's Marinée, but when she had typed in, the way you spell it is M-A-R-I-N-E, it kept saying Marine, not her name. So Rachel went in and sort of edited it so that the text that was spoken had an extra H on the end. And she didn't know what else to say, but just say it's not going to be perfect. But the degree to which it's not perfect for certain individuals and not others very much varies in what these systems, again, can or cannot do. So parents develop shortcuts. But if we say that these devices give voice, then we mask certain assumptions about different sorts of bodies and the different experiences of them. So in some, technologies that give voice to people can also create gaps between them. These tools might amplify, but their existence, just the fact that they exist, does not call the status quo of structural inequality into question, whether that is racism or other kinds of income inequalities. While mobile technologies are hailed as one of the most accessible kinds of tools for marginalized populations to use in the public sphere, due to the fact that they're really pervasive, that they don't cost a lot, that they might be easy to use, they can also at the same time contribute to being excluded in certain ways or disempowered in certain ways. So really the speaking world very often stands more to benefit from metaphors about voice and voicelessness than do people with communication disabilities themselves, unless the social, cultural, legal, political, and technological frustrations that they and their families express are heard and acted on, whether that's by educators, policymakers, or technology developers. So as sort of a takeaway, well then how do we think a little bit differently? I don't really so much offer an alternative to the phrase giving voice to the voiceless, as I do for arguing to keep voices attached to people. And I'm riffing here off of, there's actually an assistive technology historian at the Smithsonian. Her name is Catherine Ott, and she co-edited this volume called Artificial Parts, Practical Lives, the Modern Histories of Prosthetics. And I was really drawn to this quote in the introduction to the book. She says, focus on the materiality of the body, not only or exclusively its abstract and metaphoric meanings. Keeping prostheses attached to people, as opposed to using kind of metaphors about prosthetics in like general language. Keeping prostheses attached to people limits the kinds of claims and interpretive leaps a writer can make. So I think also when it comes to some of these ways that we really get pretty far abstract about voice, and it's not as much tied to physical bodies, material ways in which bodies interact in the world, and ways in which institutions shape that. So wanting to pull back to that ways in which we see through that lens. Another way we have to think about voice is thinking about the ways in which people with disabilities themselves frame their own ideas of voice and the conditions under which that gets framed. So this is at the Democratic National Convention this past year, a screenshot from CNN of disability advocate Anastasia Somoza speaking. Her speech was in part a response to Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the RNC, in which he talked about being a voice for individuals. And her response was saying, Donald Trump doesn't hear me, he doesn't see me, and he certainly doesn't speak for me. So this kind of push and pull about what voice means and the conditions under which it gets to be expressed and by who is something that really people with disabilities are taking the lead on here to think about. Another way in which, besides the sort of like political dimension, is just in thinking about voice as a way in which we access technology. So this is a headline about Amazon Alexa, that voice is the next big platform, and Alexa will own it. So this is about Amazon's personal assistant is about to stretch beyond just the echo and get downright chatty with everyone. So voice itself as a way to access technology. But again, we have to think about what ideas about the normal voice are baked into these technologies. Whose voices do they hear or not hear? Especially when you think about, this is a screenshot of another article from Scientific American, why Siri won't listen to millions of people with disabilities. Speech recognition systems promise the world, but for more than 9 million people with voice ailments, that world is out of reach. So in the same way, simultaneously, we can think of voice as access here, as a hands-free, motor-free way of using technology, but all the simultaneous ways in which the metaphor of voice can be overused. So to wrap up then, technologies that give voice to the voiceless can also reproduce different kinds of structural inequalities. Again, more on that in the book, and more nuances to that. But having a voice And being heard isn't just about technology, but about the ways in which different kinds of resources are distributed and often in very unequal ways. The book is actually, funny enough, the first book-length study of the iPad in general. So outside of disability, outside of kids stuff, nobody else has written like an academic book that just focuses on tablet computers as this pretty mobile communication, like scholars or people who study that tend to focus more on the phone as a thing, as if these have now not reached pretty large penetration in society. So this is sort of one way of thinking about the iPad. But it's interesting to think about that, thinking about users that are often marginalized as a way of thinking innovatively about a pervasive technology. I'm really interested in that, in the ways in which disability is like a resource in communication studies for doing this kind of research. So we need to keep voices attached to people in how we build our technology, or else we risk destroying. I think I changed it to dismantling here, but you can pick your outlook on these things. So our media ecology and our political environment is rapidly changing, and at stake is not only which voices get to speak, but who's thought to have a voice to speak with in the first place. And that's my talk.